You're having one of those nights. Maybe it was a fight, maybe something broke, maybe you don't even know why you're crying. You just are. And then it happens. Your dog gets up from wherever they were, walks across the room, and does something that stops you mid-breath. They press their nose into your hand, or lay their head in your lap, or just sit against you, silent, still, watching your face. And in that moment, you wonder something that no one ever fully answers. Do they actually know? Not just that you're sad, but why, what you're feeling, whether they feel it too. Most people assume it's instinct. They smelled a change, they heard something in your voice, conditioned behavior, coincidence maybe. But the neuroscience tells a completely different story, and what researchers have discovered about what's happening inside your dog's brain in that exact moment is going to change how you see that interaction forever. Let's start with the obvious theory, because it sounds reasonable. Dogs have exceptional noses. They can detect cancer. They can smell blood sugar changes in diabetics before a medical device registers them. So when you cry, maybe they're just detecting the chemical shift in your body, cortisol rising, sweat changing, something biological. That would explain it perfectly, except it doesn't explain this. In 2012, researchers at the University of London ran an experiment. They had dog owners and strangers sit in a room with a dog present. Then each person did one of 4 things. They talked normally, they hummed to themselves, they pretended to cry, or they actually cried. The dogs didn't move toward people who were talking, didn't move toward people who were humming. Even when the owner was humming and a stranger was pretending to cry, the dogs approached the stranger first. They weren't just responding to familiar scent. They weren't just oriented toward their person. They were specifically drawn to whoever was showing emotional distress, regardless of who that person was. That is not an animal responding to a chemical signal. That is an animal responding to suffering. But here's where it gets deeper, because researchers weren't satisfied with just knowing dogs respond to crying. They wanted to know what's actually happening in the dog's brain when it does. In 2018, a team in Hungary published a landmark study in the journal Royal Society Open Science. They used fMRI brain scanning, the same technology used to map human emotion, on dogs. Awake, unrestrained dogs, trained to lie completely still in a scanner, and they showed them images and played sounds of human emotional expressions while watching their brains in real time. What they found was stunning. Dogs have a region in their brain analogous to the human fusiform face area that activates specifically when processing human emotional faces. They're not just seeing a face, they're processing emotion. The dogs showed stronger neural activation to negative human expressions than positive ones. They weren't just reading your face, they were prioritizing your distress. That's not conditioning, that's not coincidence. That is a brain built to monitor your emotional state. Now I want to tell you about an experiment that sounds simple, but the finding is almost impossible to explain. Researchers at Goldsmiths University set up a scenario where a dog's owner and a stranger were both sitting quietly. Then one person, either the owner or the stranger, began to cry. They were measuring what the dog would do. The obvious prediction, the dog goes to its owner. Attachment, bonding, loyalty. Simple. That's not what happened. When the stranger cried, the dogs went to them just as readily as they went to their own owner. And the behavior wasn't just proximity seeking. The dogs engaged in what researchers classified as comfort-oriented behavior, soft body contact, face licking, stillness, the same repertoire they used with their owners. But here's the detail that changes everything. The dogs who went to comfort the stranger showed measurable signs of stress themselves. Their body language was tense, their cortisol was elevated. They weren't just responding to crying, they were sharing the distress and going anyway. What that means is this: your dog doesn't just detect your pain, your dog feels something like it and chooses to come to you despite that feeling. That is the functional definition of empathy. And no, it's not just dogs being dogs. Researchers tested the same scenarios with cats, with other mammals. The specific, consistent, cross-individual comfort response to human crying is almost uniquely dog behavior. This wasn't something that emerged randomly. It was shaped. Because here's the thing almost no one considers. For 15,000 years, the dogs who could read human emotion most accurately survived better. They integrated better into human groups. They received more food, more protection, more breeding opportunity. Evolution didn't just give us dogs. Evolution gave us dogs tuned to our emotional frequency. There's a specific genetic discovery that makes this undeniable. Scientists studying Williams syndrome, a human genetic condition that causes intense, indiscriminate friendliness and extreme sensitivity to other people's emotional states, found something extraordinary. Dogs carry highly similar genetic variants in the same chromosome region associated with these traits: the hypersociality, the emotional attunement, the compulsive need to comfort. It's not metaphor. The molecular mechanism that makes your dog come to you when you cry may be genetically related to the same mechanism that makes humans with Williams syndrome feel other people's emotions so intensely it becomes overwhelming. Your dog isn't just friendly. Your dog is in a measurable genetic sense wired for emotional fusion with humans. Now let's talk about what your dog is actually experiencing in that moment, because this is where people get it wrong. The common argument against dog empathy goes like this. Dogs are mimics. They learned that crying equals human attention. They approach crying because approach has been rewarded in the past. It's operant conditioning, not empathy. Here's why that argument collapses. In a study from Lund University in Sweden, researchers measured dogs' heart rate variability during exposure to their owner's distress, the same autonomic measure you'd use to assess emotional stress in humans. When owners cried, dogs' heart rate variability dropped. Their nervous system shifted into a stress response. Then researchers measured the cortisol in dogs' saliva after comforting their owners. It was elevated. The dog's stress was real, physiological, measurable. An animal running a learned behavior for a treat doesn't show a stress response before and during the behavior. An animal that is actually moved does. Your dog isn't performing comfort. Your dog is experiencing something that compels it to come to you, even when doing so costs them something emotionally. And there's one more layer to this, the layer that almost no one talks about. Because dogs don't just respond to crying. Research shows they specifically respond to your crying differently than a stranger's. Not by ignoring strangers, they comfort strangers too, as we saw, but with their owner, something additional activates. When your dog comes to you while you're crying and you make eye contact, both of your oxytocin levels spike simultaneously. That's the same neurochemical loop I've described before, the one that only exists between dogs and humans, the one that no other species shares with us. But here's the piece that breaks the conditioning theory completely. That loop doesn't just activate from positive interaction, it activates from emotional resonance. When your dog perceives that you need them, not just that you're present, not just that you might have food, the bond chemistry fires. What that means is that your dog comforting you when you cry isn't separate from the bond you have. It deepens the bond. Every time your dog comes to you in distress, both of your nervous systems are writing each other into memory more deeply. The relationship is literally strengthened by your pain. Now I need to tell you something that works in the other direction, because just as dogs respond to your distress, yours responds to theirs, and dogs hide pain impeccably. Veterinary behavioral researchers have found that dogs show emotional distress through almost invisible microsignals: a slight shift in posture, a fractional change in tail carriage, avoiding eye contact by centimeters, sleeping in a slightly different position. Signals most owners miss entirely. If your dog has stopped coming to you when you're upset, don't assume they've grown distant or that you've done something wrong. Watch for the other direction too. Watch whether they're seeking you for comfort they can't communicate with words, leaning slightly more than usual, staying closer than normal. Those aren't quirks, those are signals. And there's a harder truth buried in the research. Dogs who have experienced neglect or trauma show a specific pattern when their owner cries. They freeze. They don't approach. Some look away. This is not coldness, it's a trauma response. An animal that learned that distress in a human environment meant something unsafe was coming. The inability to comfort is often the most heartbreaking evidence of what that dog has been through. The dog that comes to you when you cry has learned something profound, that closeness to your pain is safe, that they can be present in your worst moments without consequence, that you specifically are a person it's safe to run toward. A dog that does that for you has chosen to trust you with something very fragile. So the next time you're on the floor at 2 a.m. crying over something you can't even fully explain, and that animal gets up, walks over, and presses against you, remember what's actually happening. They felt a shift in your emotional state. It activated their brain's emotion processing center. It triggered a physiological stress response in them, and they came anyway because 15,000 years of shared evolution, a neurochemical bond unique to our two species, and a genetic architecture that may mirror the deepest human capacity for empathy, all pointed at one thing. Being next to you in your pain is exactly where they're supposed to be. And the oxytocin flooding both your systems right now, that's not just comfort. That's the oldest friendship on Earth, doing exactly what it was built to do. If this changed how you see your dog, subscribe and tell me in the comments about a moment your dog came to you when you needed them. I read every single one. And if you want to understand what your dog actually sees when they look at your face, whether they recognize you specifically or just a human, that's the next video. And the answer is stranger and more beautiful than you'd expect.